My name is Beatrice Lowell. I am 64 years old, a widow, and the quiet architect of a life built from long days and sleepless nights. I spent 40 years balancing invoices, sketching late into the dawn, and keeping a family together when the ground beneath us often threatened to give way. People once described me as dependable, gentle, someone who held everything together with invisible thread. Yet on the night of my only son's wedding, all of that history, every sacrifice and every memory was reduced to a sneer. It happened so quickly that I almost questioned if I had heard correctly. The ballroom was bathed in golden light, crystal chandeliers spilling warmth across polished marble floors. The scent of roses mingled with champagne. Guests laughed too loudly, eager to impress. Silver cutlery tapped porcelain plates in a nervous rhythm. And then, from across the table, Marissa, my new daughter-in-law, leaned slightly toward her friends. Her voice carried just enough to reach the ears she wanted. With a dismissive curl of her lip, she said, "The kitchen is for the help." The air seemed to fracture. A few of her friends giggled, quick and shallow as though rehearsed. Others exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or recoil. My son Daniel, tall and confident in his tuxedo, tightened his jaw and looked away. He did not defend me. He did not even acknowledge what had been said. He simply straightened his tie, as though that tiny adjustment could erase the sting of his wife's cruelty. For a heartbeat, I felt my chest collapse inward. My fingers trembled around the stem of the champagne glass. The humiliation burned hotter than any flame. Yet outwardly, I remained still. I had been overlooked before. I had been underestimated more times than I cared to count. But something about the way her words sliced through the air, the way she turned me into invisible furniture at my own son's celebration, made me realize that silence this time would no longer serve me. So I smiled. Not the soft, forgiving smile of a mother, not the polite smile of a hostess. It was thin, deliberate, sharpened by decades of restraint, the kind of smile that precedes an earthquake. I reached for my phone. Its weight was small, but in that moment it felt like steel. With practiced ease, I pressed a single number. When the familiar voice of Richard, the firm's financial director, answered, my tone was steady. "Block every account forever." There was no hesitation, no request for clarification. Richard had worked beside me long enough to know that when I spoke like that, it was final. "Understood, Mrs. Lowell," he said, his voice clipped. I ended the call, slid the phone back into my clutch, and folded my hands in my lap. The reaction was instant, though silent. Marissa's face lost its glow. Her hand, still adorned with a diamond Daniel had not earned, twitched toward her purse. She must have felt the vibration of notifications, alerts of frozen assets, inaccessible cards, vanished funds. Her knuckles whitened against the napkin in her lap as she forced a smile to mask the panic blooming across her features. The truth was undeniable. The world of luxury she flaunted, designer gowns, first-class flights, endless champagne, had never been hers. It had always been mine, and in a single command I had taken it back. Around us, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation stumbled into silence. A violinist in the quartet missed a note before recovering. A distant cough echoed, strangely loud in the pause. One woman across the table stared at me, her eyes wide, a mixture of shock and admiration. She recognized what had just happened, even if no one dared to name it aloud. Daniel's expression wavered. He sensed the shift but could not trace it. He looked at his bride, then at me, searching for clues in faces that had already told him everything he needed to know. His silence in that moment was louder than any insult. I sat perfectly still. I lifted the untouched glass, held it near my lips, then set it back on the linen tablecloth without drinking. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of finality. The power dynamic in the room had turned on its axis, and every guest felt it. Marissa attempted to laugh again, but it came out brittle. She smoothed the fabric of her gown, eyes darting across the room for someone to anchor her, but no one met her gaze. She was alone in her unraveling. And me? I breathed. For the first time in years, I breathed without carrying the weight of someone else's entitlement on my back. That wedding, meant to symbolize legacy and continuity, had instead become my quiet declaration. They thought they could erase me with one cruel sentence. They thought age had dulled me, that grief had weakened me, that silence meant surrender. But they did not know that silence, when wielded carefully, can roar louder than thunder. They had underestimated me for the last time. I let my eyes travel around the table. Guests shifted in their seats, uneasy. Daniel fumbled with his cufflinks. Marissa swallowed hard, her smile crumbling. And I realized in that precise moment that this night was not their victory. It was mine. They believed they had humiliated me into irrelevance, but they had only reminded me of my own strength. And here is the truth I carried like a secret blade. That phone call was only the beginning. They thought I had given them everything already, but they had no idea. I still had more than one call left in me. And this story, the one I'm about to tell you, begins with that single smile, that single order, and the silence that followed. After the wedding night shifted in that single moment of silence, my mind did something curious. It carried me backward. It is strange how humiliation can stir not only anger, but also memory, unspooling years of sacrifice like a reel of film. Sitting there, surrounded by music and laughter that no longer touched me, I thought of the girl I once was, of the woman I became long before anyone called me invisible. I married young, perhaps too young, though in those days it felt right. His name was Michael. He had a laugh that filled a room, a laugh so deep it rattled the windows of our first apartment when he told me stories late at night. We didn't have much. A crooked table, chipped mugs, the second-hand couch where we fell asleep more often than in bed. But what we lacked in wealth, we made up for in devotion. Michael was a carpenter, hands always dusted with sawdust, and he carried the scent of cedar everywhere he went. For 10 years, he was my partner in every sense. We shared everything: bills paid late, mornings with burnt coffee, dreams of a little house with a garden. Then came Daniel, our miracle child, whose arrival felt like the universe handing us a reason to keep fighting. We were so proud of every messy drawing he taped to the wall, every first step, every mommy shouted down the hallway. But life, I learned, does not negotiate. When Daniel was 7, Michael grew sick. At first, we thought it was exhaustion, long hours in the shop, too many skipped meals. Then the diagnosis arrived like a hammer splitting wood, an illness too ruthless to bargain with. Within a year, he was gone. Just like that, my laughter vanished. I was 35, a widow with a boy who still needed bedtime stories and scraped knees kissed. Grief had no time to settle into me. There were bills stacked high, and Daniel's little shoes that wore thin too quickly. I remember standing in the kitchen one night, the clock ticking past midnight. Daniel was asleep in his small room, his school bag slouched in the corner. I had pots on the stove simmering with soup for the next day and papers spread across the table, contracts, invoices, architectural sketches smudged with flour. My hands moved between them as if choreographed. Stir the pot, sign the form, wipe my eyes, measure the angles. That kitchen became my battlefield, a place where love and survival blended into one rhythm. And it was in that very kitchen that I found the object I have kept for nearly 3 decades, a card Daniel made at school. It was nothing more than folded construction paper, uneven letters scrawled in crayon, but the words branded themselves into me. On the front, he had drawn a stick figure with curly hair, holding a hammer. Inside, it read, "Mommy is my hero." That card is still with me. The corners have curled, the colors faded, the crayon smudged by years of my fingertips tracing the lines. Whenever exhaustion threatened to crush me, I opened that card. Whenever clients dismissed me or banks turned me away because I was just a woman, I pressed it to my chest and remembered that one little boy believed I could conquer the world. I worked relentlessly. I built my firm from scratch, brick by brick, contract by contract. I sacrificed evenings at the park, vacations we never took, birthdays I celebrated with a pie baked quickly between deadlines. I told myself it was temporary, that one day Daniel would understand the weight I carried, so he could walk lighter. And sometimes, when the nights grew unbearably heavy, I would take out that card and sit at the kitchen table. I would read the words again. Mommy is my hero, and allow myself to believe them for just long enough to keep going. Now, as I replayed Marissa's sneer in my mind, as I recalled the way Daniel stood silent at her side, I felt the edges of that card pressing against my heart, even though it was safely tucked in a drawer at home. That fragile piece of paper had carried me through storms, through hunger, through loneliness. It reminded me who I was. So as I sat at their wedding, surrounded by crystal glasses and whispered gossip, I knew one thing. They could strip me of respect in public. They could try to cage me in silence, but they could never erase the truth written in Daniel's own childhood hand. I was his hero once, and even if he had forgotten, I never would. That card, that simple object, was my anchor, and in the storm that was about to come, it would steady me once again. When the music swelled again and the guests drifted toward their tables, I realized something was wrong. My name card had not been placed at the family table near Daniel and Marissa. Instead, I was led by a young attendant, unfamiliar with my face, to a small chair tucked along the far side of the ballroom, half hidden behind a floral arrangement that towered like a wall. From that seat, I could see the glow of the chandeliers casting warmth over everyone else. I could hear the laughter rising and falling like waves I was not meant to ride, but I was placed deliberately apart, like a shadow at the edge of the room. It was not an accident. I know the difference between oversight and intention. At the head table, Marissa sparkled in her dress of ivory satin, surrounded by her friends, faces I did not recognize, occupying what should have been spaces for aunts, cousins, and me. She leaned close to Daniel, her smile rehearsed, her hand resting possessively on his arm. When the champagne was poured, I noticed another detail. Not champagne, not the dry, sparkling wine Daniel and I had shared to mark every milestone together, but a French red, Marissa's favorite. The toast began. Glasses clinked. Guests rose with warmth in their eyes. I stayed seated. In front of me was not a flute of champagne, not even the red wine, only a glass of water, clear and plain, set down without ceremony by a passing waiter. Perhaps they had run short, or perhaps it was deliberate. Either way, it made the point sharply enough. I lifted the glass, the water trembling faintly in the light. I raised it no higher than my chin, and when Daniel's eyes sought mine across the room, briefly, uncertainly, I did not smile. I did not nod. I did not lift my glass in agreement. I simply placed it back on the linen cloth without a sound. The silence was louder than any toast I could have given. Around me, the conversation swirled. Marissa's laughter rang brighter than the music. Her friends chattered about Paris, Milan, the shopping trips they planned, now that she was securely married into success. Every syllable was a blade, and Daniel's silence was the deepest cut of all. He did not speak for me. He did not correct her. He let the atmosphere belong entirely to her, as if I were not there at all. I sat still. That was my shield. To move, to protest would have been to grant them the spectacle they perhaps wanted. Instead, I became the immovable figure at the far table, watching, recording, learning. The years had taught me that silence could slice deeper than raised voices, that stillness unsettled those who thrived on control. The meal arrived, courses arranged with flair, plates whisked away with precision. I ate quietly, tasting little. Once a guest approached my table by mistake, thinking I was seated near the rest of the family. When he realized, his smile faltered, and he excused himself quickly, embarrassed. I felt the isolation tighten around me like a noose. From the distance, I observed Marissa orchestrating every detail. She decided when the music changed tempo. She stood to rearrange guests with the authority of a queen. She kissed Daniel's cheek while directing servers to pour more wine. He followed her gestures with obedient ease, and each time his silence grew heavier in my chest. When dessert arrived, she glanced toward me for the first time that evening, not with warmth, not even with polite acknowledgement. Her eyes carried a flicker of triumph. She had placed me in the shadows and believed she had won. She mistook my composure for defeat. I reached again for my glass of water, cool against my fingertips. The room cheered for the new couple, forks clinking on plates. I lifted the glass just slightly, catching the chandelier's light, then set it down once more without a sound. My quiet refusal to join the charade drew no applause, but it echoed in my bones. I knew then what kind of woman Marissa was, and more painfully, I knew what kind of son Daniel had chosen to become. The boy who once pressed a crayon card into my hands had grown into a man who allowed his mother to be seated apart, her place stolen, her voice erased. Still, I did not weep. I did not plead. I sat in silence, tasting only water, watching the theater unfold. And as I sat there, I felt the stirrings of something deeper than sorrow, a quiet, sharpened resolve. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is preparation. After the dinner plates were cleared and the music softened into something slower, I slipped away for a moment, needing air. The hotel's marble hallway stretched long and cold, lined with tall mirrors and doors that opened into smaller rooms. I stepped into the quiet, letting the echo of laughter fade behind me. My heels clicked softly against the floor. I paused near one of the doors left slightly ajar. Voices floated out, familiar, sharp. Marissa's tone carried first, low and purposeful. All it takes is one mistake from her, one wrong signature. If she signs something without reading, we'll have the proof we need to strip her rights. No more approvals, no more controls, everything under our name. I froze. My hand clutched the strap of my purse as though it might steady me. Through the narrow slit of the door, I could hear Daniel's voice. Not raised, not outraged, just quiet, almost resigned. He didn't argue. He didn't defend me. His silence was an agreement, a consent by omission. The words pressed into me like ice. My breath hitched, shallow. My own son, the boy I nursed through fevers, the boy who once left me that card that read, "Mommy is my hero," stood in that room letting his wife discuss how to dismantle me piece by piece. I should have stormed in. I should have shouted. But instead, I stood motionless, every muscle stiff, every nerve frayed. And then something shifted inside me, a stillness heavier than grief, sharper than betrayal. I turned and walked away, each step deliberate, echoing against the marble. Back in my chair at the far edge of the ballroom, I kept my face composed. No one saw the quake inside me. No one saw the trembling in my hands as I lifted my water again. But beneath that trembling, a decision began to take shape. That night, when the guests finally filtered out and the music wound down, I returned home alone. The house was quiet, only the faint tick of the old wall clock filling the silence. I sat at the oak desk that had borne the weight of countless bills, contracts, and forms across decades. My hands rested on the polished surface, still trembling. But this time, the trembling was not from weakness. It was the final tremor before steel hardens. I dialed a number etched into memory. My attorney, a man who had known my husband, who had once drawn up the papers that built the foundation of our estate. His voice on the other end was steady, grounding. "I need to make changes," I said, my voice low but firm. "Everything must go into a private trust, effective immediately. Every account, every asset. I don't care how late it is. Draft the papers tonight." There was a pause, then a quiet, "Understood." When the documents arrived the next morning, I sat again at that desk, sunlight filtering pale and gray through the curtains. My fingers hovered over the pen, the weight of the decision pressed into my chest, and then I slowed everything down. I looked at my hand, veins blue against thin skin, the knuckles stiff with age. They trembled as they always had these last months, a reminder of time's grip. But I placed the pen down with care. I steadied it against the page. I signed my name once, slowly, deliberately, each curve of the letters written as if carved into stone. My hand shook when I set the pen aside, but inside, something steadied. I whispered to the quiet room, to the ghosts of my husband and to the boy Daniel used to be, "This is the last time I tremble because of them." The papers were sealed. The assets moved beyond their reach. No careless signature could undo me now. No manipulation could trick me into surrender. The quiver in my hand no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to transformation. When I leaned back in the chair, the old card fluttered down from the shelf above. "Mommy is my hero." The edges worn soft by years. I let my fingers brush it once. Then I set it gently back in place. They thought I was fragile. They thought I could be erased. But I had signed not just papers that morning. I had signed the beginning of their awakening. The morning after signing those papers, I woke to a stillness that felt different. Not the numb silence of despair, but the calm after a storm finally breaks. The air in the house was crisp, touched by the scent of coffee drifting from my kitchen. For once, I wasn't rushing to meet someone else's needs. I poured myself a cup and sat near the window, watching the light slide across the old oak floor. It was then my phone buzzed. A message from Clara, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. We met when our boys were in grade school, long before life had carved such deep lines between who I was and who I had to become. She had heard through a mutual acquaintance that Daniel was married now. "I'd love to see you," she wrote. "I'll be in town today. Coffee?" I hesitated. My instinct was to retreat, to keep my shame private. But something inside nudged me forward. I replied yes. That afternoon, I drove to a small cafe tucked off Main Street. Clara was already there, sitting at a corner table, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She looked up and smiled, her face lined not with weariness, but with a kind of strength I instantly recognized. "Beatrice Lowell," she said warmly, standing to hug me. "It's been too long." Her embrace was steady, grounding. We sat, and for a while we exchanged the small talk of old friends. But Clara's eyes were sharp. She saw through the veneer I tried to wear. "You look thinner," she said softly, not as a judgment, but as an observation. "And quieter. Something's weighing on you." I lowered my gaze to the cup between my hands, steam curling into the air. "It's Daniel," I admitted, "and his wife. They treat me as though I am already gone, as though the years I spent building this family, holding it together after William died, were nothing more than dust." Clara's expression shifted, her jaw tightening. "I remember those years," she said. "I remember you working 2 jobs, showing up to school plays, carrying that boy through every storm. I remember when you almost collapsed from exhaustion, but you still made it to the parent-teacher meeting with cookies." In hand, her words pierced me with both comfort and pain. She hadn't forgotten. She had seen. I shook my head slowly. Daniel doesn't remember any of that. Or maybe he does, but chooses not to. And Marissa... My voice faltered. She sneered at me at their wedding, told me the kitchen was for the help, and Daniel said nothing. For a long moment, Clara was silent. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, firm, unshaking. "They may have forgotten," she said quietly, "but I have not. I remember who built that house, who gave every piece of herself so that boy could stand tall enough to have a wedding in the first place. They may rewrite the story to fit their comfort, but truth has its witnesses. I am one, and you are another." Something in my chest loosened at her words. For weeks, months, maybe even years, I had felt invisible, erased by the very people I had given everything to. But sitting across from Clara, I realized I was not alone. My life, my sacrifices, my love, they had been seen. I blinked back tears. Sometimes I wonder if I became invisible the day William died, I confessed, as though my role was only defined by being his wife, Daniel's mother. Without them, I don't know who I am anymore. Clara squeezed my hand. "You are still Beatrice. You are the woman who held the walls upright when they wanted to fall. You are the one who poured love into every empty space. They can ignore it, they can disrespect it, but they can't erase it. That kind of devotion leaves a mark too deep to vanish." Her words were not grand. They were not wrapped in pity or dramatics. They were simply true. I inhaled deeply, letting the truth settle inside me. For the first time in a long while, I felt less like a ghost and more like myself again. Clara's presence was like a mirror held up before me, not to show my wrinkles or weariness, but to reflect back the dignity I had almost forgotten I carried. When we stood to leave, she hugged me again, her voice close to my ear. "Beatrice, never forget, your story doesn't end with them." As I walked back to my car, the words followed me like a lantern in the dark. Someone still remembered. Someone still saw me. And maybe that was the beginning of remembering myself. By the end of that week, whispers moved faster than traffic on Lakeview Drive. What began as a ripple at the wedding became a current through fundraisers, gallery openings, and brunches, where favors pass behind polite smiles. A florist tried to confirm a payment and found the account suspended. A concierge said the honeymoon suite needed a different card. A boutique refused to release a dress because the wire never arrived. News spread by lifted brows and chairs drawn closer when my name surfaced. I did not correct anyone. I walked in the mornings, watered my geraniums, read the paper with coffee, and returned calls from vendors. Each conversation was spare. "Thank you for checking. The foundation will handle future invoices." If a voice pressed for details, I repeated the line and ended the call. Marissa unraveled in increments. She blamed clerical errors, then jealous parties, then an unnamed saboteur. I did not reply. I folded laundry, the clean scent steadier than any apology typed on a screen. Daniel called twice the first day, 4 times the second, and sent a message long enough to wrap a city block. He wanted clarity. He wanted to protect his wife. He wanted me to explain so he could reassure donors. I read until the lines blurred, then turned the phone face down. His silence at the wedding had felt like a verdict. Now my silence returned the judgment. I would not argue by text, and I would not rescue him from consequences he created by looking away. The registry followed the accounts. Friends who had pledged experiences asked questions when transfers stalled. A woman from the museum board called to confirm whether I had purchased a private retreat. I answered plainly. I did not authorize any gift. Her pause told me the truth landed. By evening, the ledger of delays read like a catalog of entitlement. Travel fund, furniture credit, commissioned portrait, monthly flowers. Through it all, I stayed outwardly calm. I sorted a drawer in the study, stacked invoices, and slid the card that said, "Mommy is my hero," into a protective sleeve. That small act felt like setting a cornerstone. It reminded me that my worth could not be revoked by anyone's performance, not even by my son's. Every time the phone buzzed, I let it ring once before choosing whether to answer. Most times, I did not. Marissa requested a meeting through Richard, thinking perhaps a man could coax me. He relayed her message. I told him to send a sentence. Mrs. Lowell is unavailable. Any necessary communication may proceed in writing. The boundary landed like a door closing softly yet completely. Power reversal rarely looks like lightning. Often it is the absence of noise, the decision to let people meet themselves without your commentary. At luncheons, I kept my schedule brief. If someone pressed for the inside version, I asked about their children. The urge to explain rose and fell. I strangled it gently and moved on. Daniel arrived at my gate on Friday evening, carrying the stiffness of a man who had learned the scaffolding beneath his life might not belong to him. He rang the bell. I watched through the glass. When I opened the door, he searched my face for permission to be a boy again. I offered a seat on the porch. The sky dimmed very quietly. He began carefully, insisting he needed to clear up misunderstandings, that Marissa felt targeted, that I was being misled by bitter voices. Silence is not emptiness. It is a mirror that forces the speaker to see himself. Daniel tried again, circling familiar phrases, appealing to optics and reputation. When he finally asked what he should tell people, I gave the only words I intended to offer. Tell them I am well. Tell them the foundation is reorganizing my affairs. Tell them nothing else. He asked if I would restore access for appearances until the press calmed. I looked past him to the hydrangeas I had pruned that morning. Their pale heads nodded in a barely moving wind. No, I said. Appearances are how we arrived here. He left with shoulders squared against weather that was not blowing. Instead, I let him walk to the car without rescue. My silence followed him down the path like a shadow he could not shake. That night, I brewed tea and stood by the window. The city glowed. Somewhere inside it, the story kept rewriting itself without my consent. I realized the most decisive sentence I had spoken all week contained no explanation at all. I had said no to the noise. I had said yes to the dignity of quiet. The call came late in the evening, long after the streetlights had clicked on and the last jogger had passed my porch. I was in the kitchen, the same room where I had once balanced accounts, stirred soups, and read bedtime stories aloud to a boy who used to think I was his whole world. The phone vibrated on the counter. I saw Marissa's name flash across the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring into silence, but something in me wanted to hear her voice, perhaps to finally meet the storm head on. I swiped to answer. Her tone was shrill, brittle from the start. "Mother, why are you doing this? Do you realize what you've done? You've embarrassed us in front of everyone. Do you know how many calls I've had to return? How many explanations I've been forced to invent?" Her words tumbled fast, coated with indignation and fear. I listened, holding the phone slightly away from my ear, as though distance could dilute the poison. She didn't pause long enough to breathe. I waited until her fury flickered into silence, the kind born of expecting me to rush in with apologies, excuses, or desperate justifications. But the woman she expected, the one who had bowed her head for years, was no longer on the line. My voice was calm, steady, stripped of every layer except truth. "I did it because I heard you, Marissa. I heard every word you whispered about waiting for me to slip, about taking everything I built and twisting it into your proof of victory. I did it because silence at that wedding was louder than any shout, and I finally understood. I have nothing left to lose except my self-respect, and that I will not give you." The line went quiet. I could almost picture her face, lips parted, eyes darting as she searched for the next performance. She tried once more, softer now but edged with contempt. "You're overreacting. You misheard. Daniel and I only wanted to help. Why would you punish us like this?" I closed my eyes. For a moment, I felt the ache of decades, every sacrifice, every compromise, every time I had stayed silent to keep peace. But tonight, My silence was not submission. It was my weapon. "I am not punishing you," I said, choosing each word with precision. "I am protecting what is mine. And more importantly, I am protecting who I am. That is not something you get to rewrite. Not anymore." Before she could spin another story, I pressed the red button and ended the call. The sound of finality, the click of the line disconnecting, was sharper than any argument. I placed the phone back on the counter. The house exhaled around me, settling into its own quiet. I leaned against the chair, folded my hands together, and let out a long breath that carried years of restraint. For the first time, I did not feel guilty. I did not feel cruel. I felt free. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of boundaries I had drawn, full of clarity I had chosen, full of the dignity I had retrieved piece by piece since the moment she sneered at me in public. My silence was not the absence of words. It was a presence, a stance, a declaration that I no longer needed to justify myself. I sat for a while in that kitchen, surrounded by shadows stretching against the walls. The same room that once defined my servitude now became the stage of my reclamation. I thought of William, of the nights when he told me dignity mattered more than wealth, more than recognition. I thought of little Daniel, the boy who scribbled on that card, "Mommy is my hero," believing it without question. Tonight, I finally acted like the hero he once believed me to be. Not for him anymore, but for me. When the phone buzzed again, I let it ring until the sound stopped. I picked up my cup of tea, now lukewarm, and took a sip. The bitterness on my tongue tasted cleaner than any sweet lie I had swallowed before. I whispered into the quiet, not to Marissa, not to Daniel, but to myself. "This is the last time I explain. From here on, silence will speak louder than anything I could say." Then I turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in soft darkness, and walked upstairs with a steadiness I had not felt in years. The chapter of begging for their respect was closed. What began now was mine alone. By midweek, the calls coming to Daniel were no longer congratulations, but cautious reversals. A development fund postponed the ribbon cutting. A licensing partner requested a governance review. A lender declined to extend the bridge line he had counted on. An architecture firm withdrew from a joint proposal, citing uncertainty. His assistant forwarded each notice with strained politeness. Richard replied with one clean line, stating that the foundation was reorganizing my affairs and that no one else spoke for me. Marissa fared worse because her currency had always been image. The florist demanded payment before delivery. The boutique refused to release the couture gown. The hotel downgraded their suite when the card on file failed twice. The group chat that once lit her phone like a marquee dimmed to a few polite hearts, then went dark. Friends who loved borrowed glamour found other tables. Without easy spending, she learned how quickly certain loyalties vanish when the music shifts. I did not correct rumors or provide context. I trimmed hydrangeas, watered geraniums, dusted frames on the stair, and polished the glass over a photograph of Daniel at 10 with frosting on his nose. Each morning, I answered only essential calls. Each afternoon, I walked a quiet loop around the lake. My calm was not a performance. It was a boundary set like stone. When guilt nipped at my heels, I told myself the truth. I protected what I built and needed no permission. The first time I saw them after the wedding was at a museum benefit Clara urged me to attend. The atrium glowed with suspended lights while a jazz trio stitched the room with soft brass. I wore a dark dress that did not ask for notice and stood by a bent steel form like a rib cage, relearning breath. Clara looped her arm through mine. She moved like a woman who had survived storms and filed the weather inside. Daniel entered first, scanning the room with the bright grin he used when business was sport. The grin faltered when conversations did not open. People nodded with courtesy, then adjusted their path as if he were a draft in a warm room. Marissa followed in pearls. She lifted a flute for a photograph, then lowered it when the server declined to start a tab. Her smile tightened. She sent messages. No one answered. I remained still. There is a power in watching the world arrange itself without your hand on it. I did not revel in their discomfort. I refused to intervene. For years, I bailed water out of their boat. That evening, I let the lake be the lake. Daniel noticed me. He began to approach, then paused when he saw Clara. He measured the line between pride and need, then turned toward the far wall where no one asked questions. Clara leaned in so only I could hear. Just by staying silent, you have already won. Her breath was warm. Her tone held neither spite nor triumph. It held witness. The sentence settled over me like a shawl. I thought of my kitchen table and the bills I conquered there. I thought of the card that said, "Mommy is my hero," near my keys. Winning did not feel like conquest. It felt like accuracy returning to a room that had tolerated lies too long. Near the exit, Marissa tried a brighter smile, sharp as glass. "We should talk," she said, pitching her voice for nearby ears. I gave a small nod that meant nothing and stepped aside so an elderly couple could pass. Her expression slipped. Without an audience, the scene had no oxygen. She pivoted into the crowd, and the evening swallowed her with indifferent grace. Clara guided me toward the door while the jazz softened like a curtain, closing an act. On the drive home, the city lights looked steady, not cold. I did not gloat. I catalogued. Reputations had shifted. Rings meant less than conduct. At a red light, I touched the card in my bag, feeling ridges of crayon beneath plastic. Tomorrow, I would meet Richard about scholarships. A young applicant's portfolio glowed with discipline and hunger. The future would not be measured by tables where I was unwelcome. It would be measured by names I could help write into a kinder ledger. 2 days after the museum benefit, I met the future in a hallway that smelled of fresh paint and floor wax. The Lowell Foundation had rented a small office on the second floor of a community arts center. The sign on the door was temporary, clipped into place, but seeing my name there steadied me. Richard arranged the morning so I could meet the first scholarship recipient before the board signing. He said I might like her work. He was wrong. I did not like it. I loved it. Her name was Emily Reyes, 19, the eldest of 3, a commuter student who waited tables at night and sketched during bus rides. She entered with a portfolio pressed against her chest like a shield. Her jacket was thrift store denim. Her hair was pulled back with a pencil. When she shook my hand, her palm was cold from the windy walk across the river. We sat at a round table under fluorescent light that hummed like a patient machine. Emily opened the portfolio with a reverence I recognized. Inside were charcoal elevations of storefronts along her block, measured not by prestige but by place. A laundromat tagged with afternoon sun, a corner bodega framed as cathedral, an apartment stoop rendered with attention to chipped brick, rust stains, and shoe scuffs. I saw discipline. I saw hunger. I saw a mind that believed everyday spaces deserved kindness. She spoke quietly at first. Her mother cleaned houses, her stepfather patched roofs. College felt impossible until a teacher printed our application and nudged it across a desk. She apologized for the smudges on the drawings. She'd worked on the bus. I told her I once sketched in a kitchen that smelled of onions and bleach, signing invoices with flour on my sleeves. Her eyes lifted, surprised by the mirror. Richard stepped out to take a call, leaving us in the steady buzz of the ceiling fixture. Emily asked why the foundation chose her. I answered without varnish. Because you honor what people live inside. Because your lines listen. Because I recognize the courage tucked into your careful work. She laughed once quickly. Then her composure cracked. Tears pooled. Not dramatic, only honest. She wiped them with the heel of her hand as if embarrassed to need a softness she had not been offered lately. When she closed the portfolio, she reached for my fingers. Her grip was light, fierce, certain. "I will keep your name beautiful," she said. The sentence was simple. It landed like a bell. My throat tightened. Beauty, I realized, was not the glitter my daughter-in-law hoarded. Beauty was what this young woman intended to do with a chance. We toured the studio classrooms. She touched every drafting table as if greeting an altar. She told me about the staircase at her grandmother's building that vibrated when the I train passed. How she learned to time her steps with the rumble so she would not stumble. How design, to her, meant listening for vibrations and adjusting the world to lessen their shake. The definition was perfect. Before she left, I slid a thin envelope across the table. Inside was the first stipend and a transit pass. I asked her to send me her process pages once a month. I did not want polished posters. I wanted smudged trials and messy notes. She nodded like a soldier accepting orders. At the door, she paused. "My block knows your last name," she said. "They will think of wealth. I will make them think of welcome." Then she was gone, quick down the stairs, a flash of denim and pencil. I stood alone in the humming light and understood that the story of my name had changed without a single speech. I did not need a wedding to confirm legacy. I needed rooms like this and students like her. The card in my purse pressed against my wallet. For years, I had read Mommy is my hero to survive another shift. Today I read it and understood the assignment anew. A hero makes space. A hero builds doors. A hero hands over keys. Outside, the wind pushed at the banners. Pigeons shuffled like clerks across the plaza. I called Clara to tell her about Emily. She answered on the first ring and listened as I described the laundromat cathedral. When I finished, she laughed softly. "There she is," she said. "There is the woman who built a house and invited the neighborhood in." Daniel came to me on a gray morning when the clouds hung low enough to press against the roofs. I had not seen him for weeks, though his absence carried its own presence. Whispers reached me. Failed meetings, doors closed, silence where applause once echoed. I thought he would send a letter, or worse, nothing at all. Instead, he appeared at my door, older in the face than he had ever looked, carrying something pressed flat against his chest. It was the card, the same small card drawn in a child's earnest hand, with marker letters crooked but triumphant. "Mommy is my hero." I recognized the smudges from greasy fingers, the faint scent of paste from school craft bins. My breath caught because I had not touched it in years. It had been folded into my wallet until the edges tore, then tucked into a drawer for safekeeping. Now, in Daniel's hands, it looked like a relic discovered after a flood. He stood awkwardly, as if the threshold were a courtroom. His voice was not steady when he spoke. "I remember writing this," he said. "I remember watching you cry while you worked, and still calling you strong." He extended the card as though it might bridge decades. I took it, but the warmth did not travel between us. My fingers shook once, then steadied. His eyes searched mine, pleading for the part of me that once carried him through sickness and storms. For a heartbeat, I wanted to fold him into my arms the way I did when he was small, when the world seemed survivable, only because I promised it would be. But promises made in innocence are not always ones you can keep in betrayal. I let the silence settle, heavy, necessary. He tried again. "Mom, I forgot what you did for me. I let her words matter more than yours. His throat closed around confession. "I know you heard. I should have stopped her. I should have been your son, not her shadow." The pain of his words was sharp, but sharper still was the memory of standing in the kitchen during his wedding, humiliated, erased. I closed my eyes briefly, seeing not the man before me, but the boy at a school play, clutching a paper crown and looking for me in the audience. That boy had believed I was invincible. This man had treated me like an obstacle. When I opened my eyes, I spoke quietly, measured, not cruel, but final. "Heroes also know when to lay down the sword," I said, "and walk away alone." My voice did not tremble. The sentence carried more weight than any shout could have. Daniel's shoulders sagged as if the words themselves had stripped him of armor. He reached, tentative, for my hand, but I pulled it back, gently, firmly. The space between us widened, though we stood close enough to hear each other breathe. He whispered, "Is there no way back?" I let the question hang. In my chest, a storm raged. The longing to forgive, the need to protect what was left of me. A part of me cried to bridge the gap, but another part knew that bridges built on ash cannot hold. My silence was the answer. He looked down, nodded once as if sentencing himself, and turned. At the door, he paused, still holding the weight of the moment. He placed the card on the entry table, not in my hand, not in his pocket, between us. Then he walked away. I stood for a long time staring at the card, that fragile anchor of a life once pure. My chest tightened, but I did not collapse. I traced the letters with my fingertip and whispered, not to Daniel, but to myself. Some battles end without victors, only survivors. That day, I realized the conflict was not about punishing him or saving him. It was about choosing dignity over repetition. Whether or not I forgave him remained a question even I could not answer fully. Perhaps time would soften edges, perhaps not. What mattered was that I had reclaimed the right to decide. As I closed the door, the card remained on the table, a quiet witness. To some, it might look like paper and ink. To me, it was both the wound and the salve, a reminder that love can be real and still not be enough to keep you from breaking, and that sometimes survival is the bravest kind of love left. I watched Daniel walk down the path and disappear behind the hedge. When the door latched, the house held a quiet that did not ache. I lifted the card from the entry table and held it by the corners. The letters were bold the way children believe, the paper softened by years. I slept only a little, not from grief, but from the clarity that follows a verdict. By sunrise, I knew what I would do. I would leave the city house and move to the small cottage by the lake that William and I once sketched in the margins of unpaid bills. 2 weeks later, I drove north with a trunk of essentials and a mind rinsed clean by distance. The cottage waited at the bend of a narrow road, cedar shingles weathered to silver, a porch that creaked with welcome, windows that remembered how to hold morning light. The lake beyond lay still as a held breath. Geese stitched the surface in a patient line. Reeds nodded at the shore like old counselors. I parked beneath a birch and stood without moving, letting the wind carry pine and damp earth across my face until my pulse slowed. Inside, the rooms were small but truthful. A galley kitchen held open shelves and a deep farmhouse sink. The living room offered a worn sofa, a braided rug, and a wood stove with the humility of a reliable heart. I opened the windows and the lake answered with quiet. No sirens, no alerts, only water and wing. I unpacked in deliberate motions, as if building a new rhythm required muscle memory. A stack of plates, a tin of tea, 2 mugs, 3 books, the toolbox that never fails me. The boards underfoot spoke in shy complaints. I answered with oil along the railing and a promise to tend what holds me. Afternoon arrived gently. Shadows of maple leaves performed a slow play on the floor, a language of ease I had forgotten. When the sun slid toward the opposite shore, I brewed tea and carried it outside. The lake lay like glass. A single skiff drifted near the reeds. Somewhere a dog barked twice and surrendered. Across that stillness, I tested my breath. My heartbeat felt unhurried, as though it had found a tempo older than worry. I considered Daniel's question at the door and the space I left unanswered. Not hatred, not absolution, a boundary I finally respected. That first night, I built a fire. The wood snapped politely and the logs settled with the relief of muscles allowed to rest. Before bed, I opened the nightstand drawer and placed the card inside. Then I closed the wood gently, not to hide it, but to give it a room of its own. Days fell into a pattern that asked nothing from an audience. I woke early, walked the shore while mist rose in ribbons, learned the birds by the paths they stitched across the water. I cooked simple meals. I repaired a loose latch. I stacked kindling by size the way William taught me. Afternoons, I read student portfolios and drafted letters for the foundation. Evenings, I listened to wind skim the lake like a careful hand. My phone stayed face down. When it rang, the sound joined the crickets and faded. One afternoon, Clara arrived with a bag of lemons and a grin, bright with kindness. We sat on the porch and watched light travel across the ripples. She pointed to the chair across from me and said, as if settling a fact, that the throne suits you. I laughed. The sound felt new in my mouth. She did not ask about Daniel. I thanked her for that mercy with a refill of tea and a slice of pound cake cooling on the counter. We spoke of books, recipes, and the stubborn joy of women who refuse to vanish. Near dusk, after she left, I carried the card to the kitchen table and set it in the center. The sun had dropped low enough to pass through the bottle glass of the window. Gold broke into flecks across the paper. The words, "Mommy is my hero," glowed as if newly written. I did not weep. I let the light do what light knows how to do, reveal without noise, bless without argument. That moment was both closure and dawn. The house did not feel empty. It felt rightful. The lake kept its promise of quiet. The porch promised company when I chose it. The card promised fidelity to myself that nothing could revoke. I touched the table once and made a vow I could keep. I would live here honestly. I would give with discernment. I would guard the room where my name stays clean. When the last light slipped off the edge of the paper, I turned on the lamp and set water for tea, unafraid of the night and the new life it invited. The knock on my cottage door that morning was not urgent but steady, as if it carried memory rather than need. When I opened it, Clara stood with a wicker basket hooked over her arm, her smile blooming before the words formed. Inside the basket was a glass jar of preserved lemons, the rinds glowing like captured sunlight. She said she had made them the way her mother once showed us both, back when we were young wives learning how to stretch $1 and add brightness to plain meals. I took the jar from her hands with care. When I held it up, the sunlight pouring through the glass turned my kitchen golden. We settled on the porch, two women no longer rushing, the lake stretching wide and forgiving before us. Clara placed the jar between us on the little table, as though it deserved its own chair. She laughed that we had shared recipes, grief, even silence, but never a legacy. The word hung in the air, both weighty and delicate. I poured us tea, steam curling into the morning air, and waited until she was ready to say more. She leaned back in the wooden chair, eyes narrowing at the horizon where the line between water and sky blurred into one. Then she turned toward me and spoke slowly. "Legacy," she said, "is not the house you build or the accounts you guard. Legacy is who will keep your name spoken with respect when you are no longer there to defend it." I let the words settle. They carried more truth than any will or deed of trust could. I thought of Daniel, of Marissa, of the hollow way their names echoed in rooms that once held laughter. I thought of Emily, the young scholarship student whose hand had clasped mine and promised to carry my name with dignity. And I thought of Clara herself, who never let the world forget that I once stood strong, even when others tried to reduce me to silence. I asked Clara what legacy she believed she would leave. She smiled with a softness that comes only from years of enduring and forgiving. She said she hoped it would be laughter carried in the kitchens of her grandchildren and the quiet strength that her daughters might remember on the days they doubted themselves. She told me that money fades, houses decay, and photographs curl with time, but respect, earned by choices made in hardship, remains. We sat a long while in the kind of silence that strengthens rather than weakens. The jar of lemons glowed in the center like a small altar. I realized that in my decades of chasing provision, protecting assets, and shielding Daniel from the cold of the world, I had already built a legacy, not in the numbers of accounts or the brick of houses, but in the card he once wrote with a crayon, in the foundation now carrying students into brighter futures, in the friends like Clara who never let me disappear. I told Clara that I once feared dying forgotten, as though my years of sacrifice would vanish into paper shredded or balances erased. But now, sitting by the lake with her, I understood. My legacy was already alive, breathing in students like Emily, in neighbors who remembered my hand reaching across a fence, in the women who would repeat my story to steady themselves when life asked too much. Clara reached across the small table and pressed her hand on mine. She said gently, "That is why you still stand tall, Beatrice, because your legacy is not waiting to be written. It is already written in the respect you command without lifting your voice." The wind shifted. The porch boards sighed. I lifted the jar, turning it slowly in the light, and whispered that perhaps legacy is also in small gifts like this, preserved with care, handed across years, reminding us that what we keep alive in one another lasts longer than any estate. Clara raised her cup of tea toward me. I raised mine in return. We drank in quiet agreement. In that moment, I felt no bitterness, only clarity. When my time ends, I do not wish to be measured by what I owned. I wish to be remembered by how gently I could still hold respect, even after being bruised by betrayal. As the sun leaned westward, Clara stood, kissed my cheek, and promised she would come again with more lemons, more laughter, more reminders. I watched her walk down the path, the basket swaying, and thought to myself that legacy, indeed, is never the marble we carve. It is the way another voice will say your name with tenderness after you are gone. The morning the headline broke, I was sitting by the window with my tea, the steam lifting into the cool air. The paper had been slid under my cottage door, its crisp folds still smelling faintly of ink. Across the front page, bold letters announced that Beatrice Lowell had withdrawn completely from Sinclair Holdings, liquidated her remaining assets, and transferred the fortune into the Lowell Foundation for Education and Women's Resilience. My name was suddenly everywhere, not tied to betrayal or scandal, but to an act that confounded some and inspired others. I unfolded the paper slowly, my fingers steady now, no longer trembling as they once did when I signed contracts or orders under pressure. The photographs showed the Sinclair headquarters, dark windows glinting like cold eyes, and below them, a smaller picture of Emily shaking my hand at the scholarship reception. The contrast was striking, almost poetic. The columnists debated my decision. Some sneered that I had abandoned family duty. Others praised me for breaking chains of greed and redirecting power where it might matter most. In the society pages, voices buzzed with both criticism and awe. At the country club, I imagined Marissa trying to explain to her circle of friends why the accounts no longer swelled with endless indulgence. In the boardrooms, Daniel was likely fielding questions about why his mother had chosen principle over empire. But here, in the stillness of my cottage, the clamor seemed far away. I turned each page with care, reading the analyses, the gossip, even the sharp words that labeled me cold. For once I did not feel the sting of judgment. I had no need to defend myself, no urgency to craft explanations. My actions were their own language, clear to those willing to listen. I recalled Clara's words about legacy, how it is not what you hoard, but what lingers when your name is spoken in rooms you never enter again. She was right. Already, letters had begun arriving at the post office box I kept. Students thanking me for scholarships, women in shelters writing that they saw hope reflected in what I had done. Their words outweighed the columns of criticism by 1,000-fold. I sipped my tea, its warmth steady against the cool breeze, and let the chatter of the outside world flow past me like water. The world could debate whether I had been ruthless or wise, selfish or generous. None of it mattered now. What mattered was the quiet certainty in my chest, the stillness of knowing I had reclaimed my dignity and redirected it towards something that could not be stripped away. Through the window, the lake shimmered in the morning light. I thought of how the surface could look so calm while currents moved powerfully beneath. That was me now, no longer rushing to prove myself, no longer pleading to be seen, but steady, composed, holding depths no one could disturb. I folded the paper closed at last and set it on the table beside the jar of lemons Clara had brought days before. Both, in their own way, were symbols. One shouted my story to the world, while the other whispered it to me alone. Together, they reminded me that legacy lives both in public memory and in private friendships. When I rose from the chair, I did not feel the need to carry the newspaper with me. I left it folded neatly on the table. Those who needed to read about me would read. Those who needed to judge would judge. And those who needed to be inspired would be inspired. My work now was to live in the freedom of having nothing left to prove. As I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked beneath me, familiar and grounding. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I breathed deeply, filling myself with the scent of ordinary life. No gala, no board meeting, no courtroom could compare to this. My own choice, my own path. The headlines would fade, I knew. Another scandal, another figure would take my place soon enough. But the foundation, the scholarships, the quiet ripple of restored dignity, they would remain. That was enough. I whispered to the wind as though speaking to Daniel, to Marissa, to anyone still trying to understand. I do not owe you my silence, and I do not owe you my defense. I owe myself peace. And at last, I have claimed it. I opened my journal after the headline faded and the kettle clicked off. The cottage was quiet. The lake breathed against the shore like an animal. I dated the page, uncapped my pen, and let the first line arrive. I no longer hope Daniel returns the right way. I only know I have returned to myself. The sentence landed cleanly, neither bitter nor sweet, a measurement I could live by. Writing has always been the architecture of my sanity. Walls first, then doors. I set down the facts in rows. The accounts were closed, the foundation funded, scholarship letters sent, the city house scheduled for listing. I wrote about preserved lemons. Sunlight turned the brine to gold. The jar felt like care passed from one woman to another. I wrote about the card Daniel made long ago, resting in the nightstand like a kept vow, its crooked letters still brave. Outside, a truck rumbled up the gravel drive at the old estate we had converted to student housing. The first tenants were moving in. I closed the journal, slipped it into my bag, and drove with the windows cracked. The air smelled of cut grass and charcoal. The house greeted me with soft echoes and fresh paint. Volunteers had scrubbed the banisters. New mattresses lined the rooms. A chalkboard near the entry listed names and a request for patience while we learned the laundry schedule. The door opened wide to a parade. Emily stepped in first with a box against her hip, laughing as two students bumped shoulders in the doorway. She wore the same denim jacket and pencil behind her ear, but a ring of keys now hung from her belt like small bells. "Welcome home," I said. The words felt right in my mouth. They scattered like swallows, each drawn to a different corner of possibility. Someone set a radio on the kitchen counter. A melody shivered across tile and wood. Someone else opened every window, curtains lifted and fell like grateful breath. Emily put her box down and crossed the room to me. "We will take care of this place," she said, serious for a beat. Then her grin returned. "And we will keep your name beautiful." We both smiled at the phrase. It belonged to both of us. I walked through the room slowly, touching frames, straightening a lamp, answering small questions about outlets and storage. Laughter climbed the stairwell. Footsteps drummed a rhythm of youth I had not heard in years. They debated where to hang a poster. They negotiated shelf space with awkward grace. Someone brewed coffee strong enough to wake a city. It felt like a house learning to speak. Emily called from the porch and asked me to see the backyard. A weathered picnic table waited beneath a maple. An herb garden, recently turned, smelled of promise. We stood together and looked at the brick path I had set with volunteers last week. "These lines listen," she said, kneeling to run a finger along the mortar. I saw it too. The path curved around the lilac as if bowing. Respect can be designed. A burst of laughter spilled through the kitchen window. Someone shouted a thank you. Someone else corrected it to "thank you, ma'am," which made the first voice protest. I felt the sound travel through me like warmth. The house had found its first language. By late afternoon, the boxes were flattened and stacked, the chalkboard filled with doodles and phone numbers, the radio switched to a baseball game humming like summer. I hugged Emily at the door. She lifted the keys with a small flourish. Metal chimed. She saluted me as if we were soldiers of the same quiet war. Back at the cottage, the lake had settled into evening silver. I brewed tea, reopened the journal, and added one more line. Legacy is the way other people carry your name when you are not in the room. I placed the pen down, stepped onto the porch, and looked across the water. Somewhere behind me, young voices were learning to trust ceilings that did not leak and doors that did not slam. I let my shoulders drop. My breath came easy. I had not reclaimed a throne. I had reclaimed a life. The wind brushed the reeds in one clean sigh. I matched it with one of my own, light and certain, and watched the surface hold the sky. I have carried you through my story, and now as I close these pages, I want to leave you with one truth that has carried me further than wealth, titles, or even family bonds. If you have ever been dismissed, if you have ever been turned into a shadow in your own home, or if you have ever felt invisible at the very table you built with your own hands, remember this: you still have the power to rise. You can stand, you can breathe, and you can end the performance they tried to script for you. Sometimes the strongest answer is not in shouting or pleading, but in silence and a step away. That silence is not emptiness. It is a declaration that you are no longer available for their cruelty. Legacy is not kept in banks or balance sheets. It is not a house on a hill or the sparkle of a diamond. Legacy lives in the hearts that keep your name alive with respect when you are gone from the room. I know this now. My name is written in the laughter of students who never thought they would have a door that closed safely behind them. It is remembered in the hands of friends who never forgot who built the house before it was gilded. It rests in every life touched by the foundation I shaped, not because I wanted glory, but because I wanted decency to have a place to grow. And to you who are listening, who perhaps carry your own wounds quietly, you do not need to be the hero forever. You only need to decide when to lay the sword down and walk away with dignity. That choice is where healing begins. I made that choice at a wedding where they tried to banish me to the kitchen. I made it again when silence became my most powerful ally. And now, I make it every morning as I wake by the lake, open my journal, and write a line that belongs to no one but me. If you have faced a moment where you were treated as less than what you are, I ask you, what did you do? Did you rise? Did you walk? Did you reclaim yourself in the quiet? I want to know. Share it. Not only for me, but for the countless others who may be reading the comments, searching for a sign that they too can take their first step. Tell me, do you think I was wrong? Should I have given Daniel and Marissa another chance? Or was silence the only answer left to me? Let your thoughts flow. This is not just my story, it is a mirror for all of ours. Before we say goodbye, I would love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee where the world still feels soft and forgiving? Or is it a late night where stories like this keep you company when the house has gone still? Let me know in the comments. We read every word with gratitude. And if this story has touched your heart, consider subscribing. Not just to hear more stories like mine, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Time is the most precious gift, and you have chosen to share yours with me. For that, I thank you. Wherever you are, carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes miracles do not knock loudly at the door. They wait quietly in the corners of your life, patient, until you are ready to open your heart and see them for what they are. Take care of yourself, my friend. May your silence be strong, your dignity unshaken, and your legacy remembered not in what you owned, but in how you loved. We will meet again in the next story. Until then, hold on to the truth that set me free.